What if I were to tell you that there is a letter, an epistle, not written by one of the apostles, but written by the apostles, plural, and that it dates to the 1st century when the New Testament was being written? And what if I were to tell you that contrary to what many would say, this letter is actually authentic? It really was written by the apostles. Furthermore, what if I told you that this letter holds the key to the reliability of the Gospels? It demonstrates that the stories about Jesus really did happen. You might be wondering, if this letter is real, why haven't I heard of it? Or how come no Christians ever talk about this letter written by the apostles? Well, luckily for you, everything that I said is true, and I'm going to give you the evidence that not only is this letter authentic, but that it actually helps give evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. This is how the letter starts. The apostles and brethren, who are elders to the brethren in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, who are from the Gentiles. Greetings. The letter goes on to describe how the apostles are sending Barnabas and Paul, along with others, to go to these churches. They went to bring them instructions regarding 4 key commandments that these churches were to follow: to avoid eating anything sacrificed to idols, to avoid eating blood, to avoid eating any strangled animals, and to avoid fornication. Now, this might sound like a strange list of commands for the apostles to give, not exactly what you'd expect from the apostles if they were to give 4 important commandments that every Christian must follow. But it actually makes sense if you take into account the background of these Gentile churches that had recently converted from paganism and where eating meat sacrificed to idols was a very real daily temptation. But the next questions become, how do we know that the letter is real? And how does this letter prove that the Gospels are reliable? Well, here comes the first plot twist. The letter is actually recorded word for word in the book of Acts, which was written by the same author that wrote the Gospel of Luke in the 1st century. This, however, does not prove that the letter is authentic, at least not to many historians. In fact, a number of historians have argued that the author of Luke is just making up this letter and that the apostles never really wrote it. Before I explain how this letter gives evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels, it's important to show that Luke is not just making the letter up, but that he really is copying down a letter that has been written by the apostles. The first step is looking to see who the author of Acts was. Throughout the book of Acts, there are 4 instances in which the author puts himself into the narrative by using the word we rather than they. We did this, or we did that. Most scholars have taken this to be a claim by the author that he was present for those parts of the story. This would make the author of Acts a traveling companion of Paul. However, some people who say that Acts is not historically reliable argue that these we passages do not mean that the author was actually present for those parts of the story. There are 2 common alternative explanations for the we passages. The first is that the author is just using a fictitious literary device, trying to give historic credibility by making the book look like it was coming from an eyewitness. The problem with this view is that when authors in the ancient world put themselves into the story fictitiously, they would make themselves the main character of the story. If the author of Acts wanted to add credibility to the story, claiming to have been present for some of the events, he would have made himself the main character of Acts, or at least claimed to be present for a majority of the events. It doesn't make sense that he would have tried to add credibility to his book by making it appear to come from an eyewitness, but then only making this eyewitness be present for a few of the events. However, when you look at Greco-Roman historians who are actually recording historical events rather than writing a fictitious narrative, they pop in and out of the story at random times. This is because real historians were often not present for all of the events that they record. Therefore, when you compare the book of Acts to other books from that time period, it matches the works that record real historical events rather than fictitious narratives. Another claim that some people make is that the we passages are part of a travel journal that the author of Acts used when writing his story. Apparently, he was collecting a bunch of different sources of information for his book, and he kind of slapped all these together and created the book of Acts. And one of these sources was apparently a travel journal that used the word we instead of they. And so in Acts, when it says we did this or that, it means that he's getting that information from his travel journal. The problem with this view is that the writing style of the we passages actually matches the rest of the book of Acts, showing that it's all coming from the same author. Now you could argue that maybe the author of Acts just fit the writing style of the travel journals to his own writing style just to make it flow better, but if he did that, then why did he leave in the awkward switch to we instead of just keeping it a smooth they all the way through the story? Why wouldn't he make it just fit the rest of his narrative? Therefore, the best explanation is that the author of Acts really was a traveling companion of Paul. When the author uses the word we, it really is because he was traveling with Paul for those parts of the story. Now, since the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, this means that he would likely have gotten the contents of the letter directly from Paul. Remember, it was Paul who was carrying the letter with Barnabas to the Gentile churches, and it wasn't too long after Paul brought this letter to Antioch that the we passages start. This means that the author of Acts joined Paul soon after Paul delivered the letter to Antioch and read the letter to the church there. Therefore, the most probable explanation is that Luke either read a copy of the letter from Paul or heard Paul recite the letter. There is no reason for thinking that the author of Acts couldn't have had access to this letter. Craig Keener explains that ancient authors would have been expected to reproduce letters that they quote verbatim, and therefore we likely have a word-for-word copy of this ancient letter written by the apostles. But how does this letter confirm the reliability of the Gospels? Well, actually, this letter demonstrates something very important about how the apostles operated. One argument commonly made against the reliability of the Gospels is that the disciples were illiterate, Aramaic-speaking fishermen and peasants. They would not have been capable of writing the highly sophisticated Greek literary masterpieces that are the Gospels. Rather, the Gospels come from the hand of very well-educated Roman elites. As one scholar, Robin Faith Walsh, has recently put it, the Gospels were written by elite cultural producers. Scholars argue that the literacy rates in first century Palestine were extremely low. It is simply unthinkable that the authors of the Gospels could be the individuals that they are traditionally ascribed to, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, the first century epistle of the apostles, recorded in Acts, contains the answer to this problem. The apostles were seeking to send a letter to Greek-speaking Gentiles in Antioch. However, if the apostles didn't speak Greek, they needed to use the services of someone who did. It was common in the ancient world for illiterate people to utilize the services of someone who was able to read and write. Luckily, they had Paul on site, who was more than capable of producing Greek literary works, as his letters reveal. The apostles would have dictated what they wanted to be written, and then they sent this letter with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch. This event provides a glimpse into the way that the disciples may have operated regularly. When we look at the Gospels as literary works, they do indeed seem to have a high level of literary sophistication, copying Greco-Roman writing styles and referencing Greek and Roman literature. This does seem to be beyond the grasp of Jewish peasants. However, the authors also seem to be intimately familiar with the Jewish scriptures. They regularly make passing allusions to the Old Testament, referring to fulfilled prophecies, Old Testament characters, events, laws, and so on. Therefore, it seems unrealistic to think that the authors of the Gospels were merely elite cultural producers who did not have an extensive Jewish background. What would make more sense would be if Jewish believers, like the disciples, enlisted the help of literate Romans who would be capable of writing the Gospels in the language of the Gentiles, Greek. This would make sense of both the Gospel's Jewishness and Greco-Roman features. This is the same pattern that we have in the Epistle of the Apostles, recorded in Acts. There were numerous individuals in the early Jesus movement who would have been capable of writing Greek literature. As already mentioned, Paul, who was a Roman citizen, had a strong grasp of Greek. Likewise, Paul mentions a Christian in Corinth named Erastus, whom he called the city treasurer. Archaeological evidence has likely demonstrated the existence of Erastus, and being the city treasurer, he would have had to be part of the Greco-Roman elite. While we can't be certain just how many Christian members of the Greco-Roman elite there were, the fact remains that the disciples could have conscripted the help of these elite members when producing the Gospels. This is a very new position to me, so I'm continuing to investigate it and see how plausible it is. I'll try to keep you all up to date with this view and other views that I develop along the way, and the easiest way for me to do that is if you subscribe. So please consider subscribing to the channel since it helps the channel grow and it helps me share this information with others. Also, if you like this video, please leave a like and comment because that helps the algorithm know to recommend my video to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.